When you drag and drop a table from the Data Sources window onto a form, Visual Studio creates a number of things. It creates data-bound controls, creates a table adapter, a binding source. It also creates the Binding Navigator control. And the Binding Navigator is a tool strip that is docked to the top of the form, and this tool strip contains a variety of tool strip items that you can use for navigating and working with data. So here's an example of a Binding Navigator, and this was created after dragging the Orders table onto the Orders form. The first two tool strip items are a Move First item and a Move Previous item. If you click the Move First item button on the tool strip, you'll move to the first item in the list, in this case Orders. Click the Move Previous item button, you move to the previous item. To the right of that is the Position item. This is a text box which shows you which item you're on. And to the right of that, the Count item. This is a label that displays the total number of items in the list, in this case Orders. To the right of that, a Move Next item and Move Last item button. The plus sign to the right of that is Add New Item. The X to the right of that is Delete Item. And each of these will be named Binding Navigator, and then Move First item, Position item, Move Next item, etc. The Save button is actually a little unique. If Visual Studio creates the Binding Navigator because you've dragged and dropped a table onto a form, it will include a Save button. But if you add a Binding Navigator yourself to a form, it doesn't have a Save button. You'll have to add it yourself. The Binding Navigator is associated with a binding source, and that way it's attached to a particular table. When you click the Move Next button, you're going to move to the next record. Well, the next record in what table? Well, you control that by the binding source property of the Binding Navigator. So in the Orders form, that Binding Navigator will be associated with the Orders binding source. And therefore, clicking the Move Next button will have the binding source move to the next item in its list, which in that example is the next order. And any of the default buttons on the Binding Navigator are going to call a method of the binding source, whether it's Move Next, Move Previous, Add or Delete. Everything except the Save button actually calls a method of the binding source. You can rely on that built-in code, and you can add additional code that you want to be run when you click a Binding Navigator button. And as I said, you can add a Binding Navigator to a form. And the way to do this is you drag the Binding Navigator control from the toolbox onto the form, set the binding source property so you associate it with a table, add a Save button if you want, then add code to the Save button's click event handler to save data, and then add any additional code as needed. So let's go to demo and take a look at the Binding Navigator. I have the Data Controls sample application open in Visual Studio. Let's take a look at the Binding Navigator control form. And this form displays orders in the top part of the form and order details in the bottom part. And my data source is the Northwind database on SQL Server, and I created this form by dragging the Orders table from the Data Sources window onto the form. After selecting Details, so it would create individual controls. This Order Details table was created when I dragged the Order Details table, the one that appears as a column in the Orders table, onto the form. So I now have on this form the one-to-many relationship between orders and order details. Now when I did that, Visual Studio created a number of controls, including binding sources, table adapters, and the Orders Binding Navigator, which is this tool strip here. This tool strip has a number of buttons, each of which have built-in functionality for working with data. Now Visual Studio automatically set the binding source property of this control to Orders Binding Source, so that these buttons are working with the Orders table. Let's take a look at the buttons in here. We have Binding Navigator Move First Item and Move Previous Item. Here are the buttons to Move Next and Move Last. We have an Add New Item and a Delete. And all of these are named Binding Navigator then add item, delete item, etc. Notice that the Save button is called Orders Binding Navigator Save Item, and that's because when you add a binding navigator to a form, there's no Save button by default. You have to add it yourself, and in this case, Visual Studio did add it. Visual Studio also created some code behind this, but I then overwrote this and I moved that code into my Save Changes method. So Visual Studio wrote the this.validate, orders binding source.endEdit, and table adapter manager.update all. I just moved that code into a bit more robust Save Changes method, and I'm calling that from the Save Item button. Then the only other change I made in this was to the add. When you click the add to add a new order, I want to move the focus to the customer combo box. On this form, I also added a second binding navigator, which I then called Order Details Binding Navigator, and I associated this with the Order Details table by setting the binding source. Notice this doesn't have a Save button. I could add one if I wanted by clicking the Add Toolstrip button. Then I could go get an image of a Save button, and I actually have one. So I'll navigate out to the Images folder, select Save, and then I could give this a name and write the code that would save order detail records. But I don't have to do that here, because the Save button at the top of the form in the Orders Binding Navigator calls the Save Changes method, and that calls the table adapter manager.update all, which will save both orders and order detail records. So I only need one Save button on this form. Okay, let's run this. And I'll select Binding Navigator Control to display that form. And when I click Move Next in the top tool strip, I move from order to order, and that shows me, of course, order details for that order. If I come down to this navigator and click Next, then I move from order detail to order detail. I can add an order detail, I could delete an individual order detail. Here I can add a new order. I'll click down here and Ship Via, and then when I click Add New, the cursor moves to the customer combo box. I can delete an order, which would delete the associated order details, and I can save both orders and order detail records. So the Binding Navigator has a fair amount of built-in functionality that you can use on your forms, and you can also add to it. The next component we want to look at is the binding source component. And the job of the binding source component is to handle the data binding on the form. You can think of the binding source component as the intermediary between the controls on the form and the underlying data. So it's the binding source component's job to take data from a table and move it into controls, and then to take any changes you make in those controls and get that information back to the data table. The data source property of the binding source component identifies the data set, and the data member property identifies the data table. The binding source has a number of methods. It has a move first, move previous, move next, and move last method for navigating through rows in a table. The position property is an integer, and that's going to give you the index of the current row you're on. So if you're on the 4th row in the table, then the position property would be equal to 3, because of course it's 0 based. The count property tells you how many rows there are in the table, and the current changed event occurs when the item that's currently bound changes. So in other words, when you move from row to row, the current changed event occurs. This is a good place to do validation if necessary, or any updating on the form. The endEdit method will write pending changes to the underlying data source or the underlying table. If you want to cancel the pending changes, you can issue the cancelEdit method. The addNew method adds a row to the table, and remove current will remove the currently selected row. You use this if you want to delete. You can also do sorting and filtering with the binding source. You can use the sort property to sort the items in the list. And the sort property is a string containing one or more column names followed by ASC for ascending or DESC for descending. So there are really two ways that you could sort. You could bring the data down from the data set in a particular order, and you can use the order by clause in your select statement. You can also do the sorting on the client, and of course you can do both. You can use the filter property of the binding source to determine which rows appear in the form. And the filter property is a string which consists of an expression. So again, there are two ways you can filter. You could filter in the query, so you could select columns from a table where a condition was true. You can also filter after the rows have been returned to the client. So you could use the filter property of the binding source to only display some of the records that have been retrieved. You can do your sorting and filtering both in the query and in the binding source. There are occasions when you want to be able to work with the underlying data. So the current property of the binding source returns an object, and that represents the row that you're currently working with. And to work with the actual data, you'll first cast current to a data row view, which represents a row of data, and then you'll use the row property of data row view to work with the actual row. So let's go see how to use these methods and properties of the binding source component in a form. I have the binding source members form open. And in this form I can view and work with products. And instead of using a binding navigator, I'm using my own buttons. And I'm also in this form going to be able to sort and filter. So this form is going to show us how to use the methods and properties of the binding source component. So let's run this, and we'll see what the form does and then look at the code. So we'll click binding source component. So now I can scroll from product to product by clicking next, previous. I can go to the bottom, I can go to the top, and notice that when I go to the bottom, the next button is disabled. If I go to the first record, the previous button's disabled. I'll also disable the first button if I'm on the first row. So as I scroll to the last, that button will be disabled. Also notice in the bottom that this label tells me that I'm on product number 77 of 77. When I go to the top, I'm on product 1, then 2, then 3, etc. Well, let's go take a look at the code that does this. This code runs when I click the first button. I'm going to call the move first method of the product's binding source, and that moves me to the first item in the underlying list, which is the products table. And then I'm going to disable the previous button, and if the next button was currently disabled, I'll enable it. If I click the last button, I call the move last method of the product's binding source to move me to the end. Disable the next button and enable the previous button if need be. When I click the next button, I move to the next item in the list by using the move next method, and then I want to see if I'm at the end, so I'm going to check the position and the count. If the position is equal to or greater than count minus 1, then I'm at the end. So if there are 77 items in the list, the last one will be number 76, because it's a zero-based list. So if the position is greater than or equal to the count minus 1, then I'm at the end. I'll use similar logic for previous. If the position is less than or equal to 0, then I disable the previous button. And as I move from product to product, the product's binding source's current changed event occurs, and in there I'm going to display that I'm on product number, which is position plus 1, of the count. Okay, let's go back to the form. If I want to add a new product, I'll click Add. And if I then decide I don't want to do that, I'll click Cancel. And so let's look at the Add button. That's here. I'm going to call the Add New method of the product's binding source, and that will add a new item to the underlying list, which is the products table. Then I'm going to move the focus to the product name text box and uncheck the discontinued checkbox, because by default, products when they're added are not discontinued. If I decide to cancel, then I'm going to call the Cancel Edit method of the product's binding source, and that will get rid of any pending changes. Those pending changes were the new record, and when I cancel, those go away. If I want to delete, then I'm first going to ask the user, are you sure you want to delete this product? If the user answers yes, then I will issue the Remove Current method, and that removes the current item in the list. So that happens when I do this. I'm going to leave this product in there and not delete it. When I click the Save button, I'm going to call the Save Changes method, which is going to call Validate on the form to validate the last control we were in. Call the End Edit method of the product's binding source to write any pending changes to the products table. If invalid information was entered, that will throw an exception, which we're going to catch, and we're going to display a message box that says invalid data was entered. Do you want to cancel your edits? And if yes, we'll call the Cancel Edit method of the binding source. If there's no invalid data and the user wants to save changes, then we call the Update All method of the Table Adapter Manager. So that gives us the ability to navigate, add, cancel, delete, and save. So if we want to use the Binding Navigator for that, we certainly can, but here you see how to write your own navigation controls and understand that the Binding Navigator essentially calls the same code that we just wrote. The next thing I want to be able to do in this form is sort and filter. By default, the products are sorted by the order they appear in the products table, which is by ID. We can also sort by product name, or by price. So here we're sorting by price. Let's see the code to do that. When I click the Name radio button, that's the Name Sort radio button, that calls the Checked Changed method. And so what I then do is set the sort property of the product's binding source to product name. And what that does is immediately sort the underlying list in the binding source, which is the products table, by product name. If I want to sort by price, I'll set the sort property to unit price. And if I want to sort by ID, I'll set it to product ID. By default, these are ascending order. If I wanted to sort these in descending order, then I could just add a DESC to this. And as you see, I can't do this right now while the code's running, but I can certainly leave the application and sort this in descending order. I can also filter. Right now I'm showing all 77 products. I only want to see products where the in-stock is under 25. There are 35 of those. Or I can see all products where the price is greater than 50. And there are 7 of those. That's also very simple. I use the filter property of the binding source. So to filter on units in stock, I set the filter property to this expression, units in stock less than 25. And then only rows in the products table where this condition is true will be displayed. And for the unit price, I set the filter to unit price greater than 50. If I want to go back and see all of the rows, then I just set the filter to an empty string. So this form shows you how to use the properties and the methods of the binding source to work with data. So you can use a binding navigator or the binding source methods to move around, and you can use the sort and filter property to control how information is displayed. And then you can decide in your application whether you want the sorting to occur in your select statement or on the client, and if you want your filtering to occur on the client or in your select statement. So if you want to bring down all of the products and then be able to run many filters, it might make more sense to bring all the information down and filter locally. You could, of course, write individual queries to return units in stock less than 25, price greater than 50, etc. Let's see another example of working with the underlying data, and that's the copying data form. So here I'm displaying orders, and orders have a customer, and they also have a ship name, address, city, region, and by default, this information is going to be the same as the customer's information. So when I enter a new order, and I select B's Beverages, I already know the name, address, city, region, postal code, and country for this customer. It's in the customers table. So I really don't want to have to retype that information. What I'd like to be able to do is click the copy button and make that now the default. And now if I need to, I can change that. So let's see how that works. Let's close this down, free up a little space, and let's open up the copy data form. The copy data form shows orders, so we have an orders binding source, we have a customers binding source, and that displays the customers in this drop-down list, and an employees binding source, which is going to populate this combo box with employees. So when I click copy, I want to go into the customer table, get information for the selected customer, and then add it to the orders table. So here's the code to do that. Well, the first thing I need to do is go get information for the selected customer. So in my data set, in the customers table adapter, which is, where'd it go? There it is. The customers table adapter, I have a query called fill by customer ID, which is going to get the information for a particular customer. So the first thing I'm going to do is run that query to retrieve the information for the selected customer. The selected value from the customer combo box is the ID, and then I'll run that query and retrieve the information for just that customer. And as this note tells you, I can't just use the existing customer's binding source because it's bound to the customer ID in the orders table. And because we haven't saved the order yet, we don't know what the customer ID is. So we have an entirely separate query to bring down the information for that customer. So now I have a variable called customer row, which is going to be equal to the first row in customer list. Customer list is the table I created here in the earlier step, and that's going to have one row, which is the information for the selected customer. I'm going to then cast that to an instance of customers row, so this will be strongly typed. Then I want to know the underlying information for the order I'm currently on. So I can take orders binding source.current, which is an object, cast it to a data row view, and then get the row property of that, and then cast that to orders row. And the reason I do that is because I can then get IntelliSense on order row, and when I press dot, I get customer ID, employee ID, there it is, ship name, shipped date. So I now get IntelliSense on the columns in the order table. Order row represents the order that I just added, customer row represents the customer I selected, and now I can say order row.shipName equals customer row.company name. And in addition, Another reason to do the cast is, in addition to IntelliSense on the names, I get this is address null, is city null, is country null, a very easy way to tell if any of the columns are null. So if the customer's address is null, I'll set the ship address to an empty string. Otherwise, the order row ship address gets set to the customer row address. So the order's ship city is equal to the customer city. Same thing for region, same thing for postal code, same thing for country. And then the only thing I need to do then is tell the binding source, hey, I updated the data in your underlying list, please update the controls. And I do that by calling the reset bindings method of orders binding source, and I pass false to tell it that the structure of the table hasn't changed. Let's do this and step through the code. Select copying data. Let's add a new order, and let's select Eastern Connection. I'll click copy. So the first thing I'm going to do is go get the information for customer EASTC. And that information is going to be in this customer list table. We should be able to look in here. Column name is city. Should be able to see the value. Not seeing it, but it's in there somewhere. Okay, so that shows us that customer list has one row, and it's the Eastern Connection customer. Then I'm going to cast that first row to a customer row, and there's the information for that customer. Now I'll take orders binding source current, which is an object, cast it to a data row view, then to a row, then cast it to orders row. Well, I haven't set this yet. I'm going to set the ship name to the company name, which is Eastern Connection, and now the ship name is equal to company name. If the address in the customer row table is null, which it is not, then I'm going to set order row ship address to the customer row address. Do that for the rest of these, and then reset the bindings, and therefore I see that information here. So that gives you an idea of how to work with the underlying data, which is very good for copying and good if you're working with data that hasn't yet been presented in the form.